Most people move through familiar spaces without thinking. A hallway, a parking garage, a stairwell you've used 100 times all blur into the background. She was walking through one of those places, the kind you never second guess. The lighting was a little dim, the air a little stale, but it was close to home and close to routine. She was carrying the usual things, keys in one hand, phone in the other, mind already on the next part of her day. Nothing about the moment suggested trouble. That's why her guard softened. That's why she didn't notice the shift in footsteps behind her until it was too late. She had always relied on awareness. Years of training had taught her to read rooms, track movement, and notice the details most people overlooked. But even the sharpest instincts can dull when the environment feels safe. So when the noise behind her changed from distant to close, she didn't react fast enough. It started with a hand on her arm, tight and unexpected. Not the kind of grip someone uses to get your attention, but the kind that shuts down options. Her first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion. The brain tries to explain away what it doesn't expect. A mistaken identity. A bad joke. Someone who didn't understand boundaries. It took a full second for the truth to land, and by then the situation had already moved past the point of simple fixes. The hallway that once felt neutral now felt narrow. The distance to the exit stretched out in her mind. She knew where the corners were, where the doors led, and how sound carried in the space. But none of that helped at the exact moment someone else decided to break the rules of normal life. She tried to pull her arm free. The grip tightened. Another hand appeared. A shift in weight. The kind of coordinated movement that tells you this wasn't random. She caught a quick glimpse of one face. Blank expression. No hesitation. That was the part that hit her harder than the hands grabbing at her. Their confidence. Their assumption that she would freeze, panic, or fold. Situations like this never unfold in clean, slow lines. They jump. Something bumps her shoulder. Something shoves from the side. Her phone slips. The sound of it hitting the ground echoes in the hallway, sharper than it should be. She tries to regain balance, but momentum doesn't care about intent. Her back hits the wall, and the world snaps from routine to danger in one sharp moment. The wall feels solid and cold. The kind of surface that reminds you you're trapped between what you planned for the day and what's happening now. Her breath catches, not from pain, but from the shock of how quickly her environment turned against her. There's a moment in any unexpected confrontation when the mind tries to catch up to the body's reality. She felt herself stuck in that space for a fraction too long. Her thoughts were scattered. Why here? Why now? What did they want? But the questions didn't matter, and deep down she knew that. All that mattered was how fast she could shift from surprise to control. The hallway buzzed with low fluorescent light. One of the fixtures flickered, the kind of defect she had walked past many times without caring. Now it annoyed her. The flickering made their movements look jumpy, like frames missing in a film. She could hear one of them breathing close to her. Too close, the kind of breath people take when they think they already have the upper hand. Someone's elbow pressed into her side. Another hand pushed against her shoulder. She could smell something faint, maybe cologne or maybe the musty scent of old paint lifting from the wall behind her. Small details, but they stuck in her mind because when a situation turns dangerous, the senses try to imprint everything. She wasn't scared yet. Not in the shaking, wide-eyed way most people imagine. She was angry at herself for letting the moment get this far. Angry that she hadn't listened to the faint cue in the footsteps earlier. Angry that she had let routine dull her edge. She knew she had to act, but she also knew acting too fast without planning could make things worse. So she held still for half a second longer, not in surrender, but in calculation. She tracked their positions. She measured the pressure of each grip. She noted which side had more weight, which direction offered space, and which motions would cost her time she didn't have. The world outside kept moving, unaware of anything happening in this narrow corridor, but inside that stretch of space everything slowed just enough for her to take stock before anything else could happen. Instinct is a strange thing. It hides under ordinary habits until the moment you need it. Then it comes up fast, almost automatic. For her, that instinct wasn't simple adrenaline. It was years of training layered into muscle memory, breath control, and the ability to switch from confusion to clarity in an instant. When she felt the pressure on her arm tighten and the wall behind her press into her shoulders, something inside her snapped into place. Not panic, not fear. A shift, the kind you don't decide on. The kind that happens because your body remembers what your mind hasn't had time to organize. Her breathing changed first. Most people don't notice their breath in a crisis. They gasp or hold it or let it spiral into shallow bursts that make everything worse. She did the opposite. A slow inhale, shorter than usual, but steady. She felt her ribs expand just enough to anchor her focus. A controlled exhale followed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was the start of her system switching modes. Training had taught her that breath controls the rest, the speed of thought, the clarity of the senses, the ability to judge distance and wait without guessing. That breath signaled the internal shift from being acted upon to preparing to act. Her eyes adjusted next. The hallway didn't change, but the way she saw it did. She stopped looking at the attackers as a single problem and started breaking them into pieces. Shoulders, stance, grip strength, where their weight sat on their feet. She didn't need full profiles. She needed cues. One had more force behind the hold. Another was positioned too close, leaving little room to wind up. A third seemed unsure, grip uneven, attention split. These quick observations gave her a map of the moment, rough but workable. She didn't need perfect clarity. She needed angles and timing. The pressure on her shoulder increased as one of them leaned in, maybe trying to intimidate her or keep her pinned. The wall behind her felt steady, and instead of seeing it as a barrier, she started viewing it as leverage. Training had hammered that idea into her. Use what you have, even if what you have is limited. The narrow hallway, once a disadvantage, now offered a structure she could push off, twist against, or use to redirect force. She shifted her weight by just a few inches. It was small enough that they didn't notice, but it gave her a better base. Another memory surfaced, not as a full thought, but as instinct. A reminder about the value of disrupting rhythm. Attackers expect their target to react in certain ways. Pull away, scream, go limp, freeze. When someone breaks that pattern, it throws the aggressor off balance mentally and physically. She didn't plan the next move with words. Her body did the math on its own. Her elbow angled slightly. Her shoulders lowered. Her weight pressed into the ground in a way that would allow her to pivot if she had to. Every part of her training relied on observation before action, so she forced herself to stay in that space for another breath, no matter how urgent it felt to move. She listened. One attacker's breathing was uneven, maybe nerves or maybe exertion. Another had a heavier step, meaning he'd be slower to react. The one closest to her right side kept adjusting his grip, a tell that he wasn't confident in his control. These small details stacked together until she could almost predict which direction they'd move first. Her senses sharpened to the point where even the hum of the flickering light above her became part of the environment she was processing. The buzzing felt steady, annoying, but reliable. It grounded her. She used that steady noise as a reference point, a reminder not to let her mind drift into fear. Her training had drilled into her that focus shrinks in a crisis unless you widen it deliberately. So she forced awareness into her peripheral vision. The scuffed baseboard, the slight echo of footsteps somewhere far down the hall, the texture of the wall under her spine. All of it served one purpose: to keep her anchored in the present instead of letting her thoughts spiral. A shift in the attacker's stance to her left told her he was preparing to move her, maybe turn her, or push her farther into the wall. That hint of motion sent a signal through her limbs. Her muscles tightened, but not in tension. It was readiness, the kind that comes from rehearsing movements thousands of times until they become part of your identity. She didn't know yet what her first move would be. She only knew she was seconds from making it, and when she did, it wouldn't come from fear or guesswork, but from a lifetime of disciplined instinct taking over the moment the shift happened. It wasn't loud or obvious. Nothing dramatic changed in the hallway. The attackers didn't suddenly step back or realize what they were dealing with. The change was internal, something they couldn't see. She felt her body transition from reacting to deciding. Her weight settled in a way that gave her control instead of letting them dictate her balance. Her hands, pinned a moment before, softened instead of tensing, giving her room to move instead of fighting the force head-on. The fear that tried to creep up her spine lost momentum because she now had a plan forming, even if it was still rough. The attackers thought they had her contained. They read her stillness as compliance. People often assume that if someone stops struggling, they've given up. They didn't understand that stillness can be strategy. She let them believe it. That belief bought her a few seconds, and in a situation like this, a few seconds are everything. Her breathing stayed steady, and she kept her gaze unfocused enough that they wouldn't notice the calculation behind it. She needed them confident, unaware that the dynamic had already started to tilt away from their favor. Her right arm, the one closest to the attacker with the weaker grip, had just enough slack for her to test his strength. Not a full pull, nothing he'd interpret as a real attempt to break free, just a tiny shift that told her he wasn't expecting resistance. His hand tightened too late, a fraction of a second behind her movement. That told her all she needed. He wasn't leading. He wasn't the one in control. He was following the others, unsure and relying on their momentum. That made him the first opening. The one pinning her shoulder leaned in again, his weight settling high. High weight means unstable balance. If someone's center of gravity is above yours, a sudden redirection can force them to recalibrate. She kept that in mind as she exhaled through her nose, slow and controlled. The sound of it blended into the hallway's hum, so subtle it didn't register to them. But it signaled to her that she was ready to shift from gathering information to applying it. Control in a moment like this isn't about overpowering someone. It's about disrupting their assumptions. They expected fear. They expected flailing. They expected her to try to run in a straight line. None of those things were on her mind. Her training had taught her that power comes from angles, timing, and the ability to use the attacker's force against them. She started adjusting her stance, feet sliding half an inch on the floor. The movement was tiny but grounded her enough to prepare for leverage. The hallway was narrow enough that she could feel their breath in the air, warm and close. She used the closeness to her advantage. When people are too close, they lose the ability to see the full picture. Their focus narrows. They watch hands or shoulders, not hips or feet. She let her upper body stay still while her lower half prepared for the transition. Her hips shifted a degree inward, reinforcing her balance. Her knees softened, ready to absorb movement instead of resisting it. Their confidence was the strongest tool she had. One attacker muttered something under his breath, something she couldn't fully hear but recognized as dismissive. They thought she was contained. They thought they had done enough to keep control. They hadn't noticed her posture changing. They hadn't caught the subtle tension in her arms or the way her shoulders lowered into a ready position. They didn't hear the internal click that had turned her from a target into a problem. She watched the small tells as they repositioned. The slight stagger in one man's step. The quick shift of fingers as another tried to readjust his hold. The breath someone drew in before speaking. These details stacked into a pattern she understood well. They were preparing to escalate. Maybe to move her. Maybe to restrain her more tightly. Whatever they planned, it required coordination. And coordination meant a moment when their positions would shift, creating a gap she could use. She didn't expect to win through force. She expected to win through timing. She waited for the weight on her shoulder to change. She waited for the attacker on her right to adjust his stance again. She waited for the slight cockiness in their posture to create the break she needed. The shift from victim to control wasn't a single dramatic action. It was this quiet gathering of possibilities. It was the confidence she felt building from the inside out as her training aligned with the reality around her. Within that tight hallway, surrounded by hands and pressure and assumptions, she could feel the moment approaching. The moment when she would stop being the one held in place and start being the one dictating what happened next. Split-second decisions don't feel dramatic when you're inside them. They feel sharp, simple, almost quiet. Your mind doesn't narrate anything. It trims away everything that isn't useful. That's what happened to her. She didn't think about danger or fear or the bigger meaning of the moment. She thought about angles, weight, timing, and the single next move she could make without getting trapped. The attackers still believed they controlled the pace, but pacing only matters when the other person accepts it. She was no longer operating on their timeline. She tracked the subtle cues that most people would miss. The attacker on her left shifted his stance, loading his weight onto his back foot for just a second. That told her he was preparing to move her or adjust his grip. The one in front of her leaned in too far, trying to keep her pinned, unaware that leaning in created space behind his shoulders where he couldn't react fast. She noted these things not as full thoughts, but as quick flashes of information that pulled her attention where it belonged. This was the point where hesitation becomes costly, but also where rushing becomes reckless. She had to act in the narrow space between those two extremes. Her training had taught her that body mechanics matter more than strength. The fastest path isn't always forward. Sometimes it's a pivot or a drop or a twist that appears small, but changes the entire arrangement. She sank her weight slightly, letting her knees bend just enough to give her more power in her hips. No one noticed. To them it probably looked like fatigue or resignation. But to her, that shift was the start of a controlled sequence she had practiced enough times that her muscles knew it better than her conscious mind did. She waited for the moment when all three attackers were focused on holding her rather than anticipating change. It came quickly. One spoke to another, a short command spoken with the kind of confidence people have when they think they've already won. Voices distract. Even trained people lose a fraction of awareness when they talk. She felt their focus slip just slightly, like a rope losing tension. That was her window. The first decision she made was not to try to overpower them. Too direct. Too predictable. Instead, she aimed for imbalance. If she could break their structure, even for a moment, she could create space. And space was the beginning of control. She turned her head just enough to check the nearest arm, gauging the exact point where her elbow could strike without needing a full wind-up. The movement wasn't dramatic. It was compact and efficient. Her shoulder dropped half an inch. Her arm shifted. Her torso twisted a touch. These micromovements set up the larger motion she needed. At the same time, she pushed lightly with her back against the wall. Not enough to alert them, but enough to prepare momentum. The wall wasn't an obstacle now. It was part of her strategy. It gave her something solid to redirect energy from. She let the pressure from the attacker leaning into her work in her favor. People who push too hard often don't realize they're creating openings. His overcommitment gave her a pivot point. She planned to use his own movement against him, not through strength, but through angle. Her second decision was about focus. You can't counter three people at once. You control one, then use the disruption to influence the others. She picked the weakest link, the one with the unsteady grip. She didn't need to disable him or strike with force. She just needed to break his hold cleanly. Once one grip fails, the others have to adjust, and adjustments create more openings. She readied her legs to generate a small burst of rotational force. Not a kick or a lunge. Just a quick turn powered from her hips, enough to free her arm and shift their collective balance. Her awareness narrowed for a moment. She listened to their breathing. She watched their shoulders. She felt the exact tension of the hand on her forearm. Timing had to be precise. Move too soon, and they'd tighten their grip. Move too late, and she'd lose the advantage. She counted her breath in her head, not in seconds, but in rhythm. Inhale. Hold. Exhale with movement. The simplicity of it steadied her. Her third decision came just before the movement itself. She chose not to think about the entire escape, only the first disruption. Training had drilled that principle into her. Complete the first step cleanly, and the next will appear. Big plans fail in tight spaces. Small ones connect. Her body understood the moment before her mind fully did. Her muscles tightened in the right places and relaxed in others. Her weight shifted. Her shoulder rotated. Her hips followed. The attackers didn't see the change yet, but she felt it building like a quiet spark ready to turn into motion. They realized too late that the situation they thought they controlled had already slipped out of their hands. At first, nothing about her movement seemed threatening to them. People who rely on intimidation often mistake calm for weakness. They saw her stillness as compliance, her quiet as fear, and the slight adjustments in her posture as exhaustion. They didn't recognize the signs of someone preparing to act, someone who had trained to read pressure, timing, and opportunity. Their confidence wasn't just misplaced, it blinded them to what was happening right in front of them. The first clue they missed was the way her weight shifted. It was small, almost invisible, but it changed her leverage. They kept their hands on her as if she were static, expecting her to respond like someone untrained. Their mistake wasn't their size or their strength. It was their assumption that she would behave the way most people do under pressure. They didn't understand that she wasn't looking for an open path forward. She was looking for an imbalance she could create, and once she found it, she didn't need force to make it work. The second clue slipped by them when the man on her left leaned in. He thought he was adding control. In reality, he was removing his own stability. His weight came forward too far, and his feet were no longer positioned to recover quickly. She saw it. He didn't. The other two didn't notice either, too focused on keeping up the initial pressure rather than adjusting to a dynamic situation. They failed to see their own posture breaking down. They failed to see her using the closeness to track their breathing, their shoulders, the tension in their hands. All of that information fed into her decision-making. But to them it looked like nothing more than a trapped woman trying to hold herself together. Their next mistake came from communication. One of them whispered something sharp, maybe a command or maybe a warning. The words didn't matter. What mattered was that talking pulled his attention off her for a beat. His grip loosened just enough for her to feel the shift in his focus. People underestimate how much the body reveals when the mind wanders. His hand wasn't as firm. His stance wasn't as solid. She felt the separation, the silent space where certainty turned into assumption. That's all she needed. They also failed to watch her breathing. Most attackers expect shallow breaths, gasps, or frantic pulls of air. She wasn't doing any of that. Her breaths were controlled, low, deliberate. If they had known anything about trained response, about composure under pressure, they would have recognized that rhythm for what it was. Instead, they read it as fading resistance. They believed they had drained her energy. They thought they had broken her pace. They didn't understand that she was anchoring herself, regulating her decisions with each inhale and exhale. Their biggest oversight came when they assumed numbers guaranteed control. 3 people meant advantage, until it didn't. Their spacing was wrong, their coordination loose, their focus split. They weren't trained to work as a unit. They weren't prepared for someone who understood how to exploit small gaps. When one shifted, another adjusted awkwardly. When one tightened his hold, another stepped back slightly. Those misalignments created micro-openings. She saw them. They didn't. They also underestimated how quickly trained instincts take over once triggered. They believed that the initial shock would linger, that the hit against the wall would put her into a fog. They didn't realize she wasn't the type who stayed disoriented for long. Her mind had already reset. Her senses had sharpened. Her priorities were clear. They expected a frozen target, not someone processing every cue with practiced precision. As she prepared to act, they remained unaware of the shift happening around them. They didn't sense the tension building through her legs. They didn't see the way her shoulders lowered into a balanced position. They didn't feel her grip shifting just enough to get traction. Their focus stayed on the control they thought they had, not the control she was quietly reclaiming. By the time they noticed something was wrong, it wasn't because they recognized her skill. It was because her movement disrupted them so quickly that their bodies reacted before their minds caught up. The sudden change in tension, the break in their structure, the unexpected resistance, it all hit them at once. That instant of confusion, that sudden recognition that something wasn't going according to plan, was the first moment they truly understood they weren't dealing with someone passive. But understanding it didn't give them a chance to correct their mistakes. They had spent too long assuming the situation was settled, too long relying on pressure instead of awareness. And when that illusion cracked, they had nothing solid to fall back on. The larger lesson in what happened doesn't sit on the surface. It isn't about a single moment or a single reaction. It's about what shows up when everything familiar falls apart and you're forced to work with whatever you have. Readiness isn't loud or dramatic. It's built in quiet repetitions, in habits most people dismiss, in the discipline to stay aware even when the environment feels safe. Her training taught her that you don't rise to the level of your expectations in a crisis. You fall to the level of your preparation. When the hallway turned hostile, she didn't have time to invent courage or rethink strategy. She only had time to rely on the instincts she had earned long before the confrontation. Resolve isn't a sudden burst of bravery either. It grows from understanding that you may not control the situation, but you can control your response. She didn't know what the attackers planned, how far they intended to go, or how long the struggle would last. What she knew was that losing focus would make everything worse. So she kept her attention sharp, guided by small choices that added up. A steadier breath, a tighter stance, a careful read of the environment. Each decision reinforced her sense of control. In a narrow hallway with 3 people pressing in, control didn't come from strength. It came from clarity. People often imagine resolve as a bold declaration. In reality, it can be a quiet refusal to collapse. She didn't make any grand statements. She didn't waste energy yelling or bargaining. She conserved every bit of attention for what mattered. She didn't let panic write the next move. She didn't let fear take the lead. Fear was present, but it stayed in the background. Resolve stepped into the front because she had practiced what it feels like to stay composed under pressure. That practice shaped her thinking, and that thinking shaped her actions. The larger lesson also involves perception. The attackers saw her as someone they could control easily. They assumed their size, their numbers, and their aggression would be enough. They didn't consider that the person they cornered might have more experience with pressure than they did. They didn't expect someone calm. They didn't expect someone who knew how to work inside tight spaces or who could break their rhythm with one well-timed movement. Their mistake wasn't just underestimating her skills. It was failing to see the value of discipline. They relied on force. She relied on training. Another part of the lesson sits in how quickly situations shift. A hallway that felt safe turned dangerous in seconds. A moment of routine became a moment of survival. She didn't get a warning or a chance to prepare. People often imagine they'll see trouble coming, that they'll have time to react. In reality, trouble is fast. Readiness isn't about expecting danger everywhere. It's about being capable of acting when the unexpected happens. It's the willingness to stay aware of your surroundings without living in fear. It's the understanding that calm attention is more powerful than constant worry. Resolve also shows up in the choice to keep thinking. Many people freeze not because they lack courage, but because their mind stops offering options. Her mind didn't stop. It kept feeding her information, kept looking for angles, kept reminding her that as long as she could think clearly, she still had leverage. That matters. In any crisis, the ability to keep thinking becomes the difference between feeling powerless and finding the next step. She didn't need a full plan. She only needed the next correct action. There's also a lesson in how she managed her energy. Instead of spending everything at once, she divided her effort. A moment to breathe, a moment to observe, a moment to prepare her stance, a moment to act. Each phase built on the last, and that pacing kept her from burning out too early. Resolve isn't about going full force from the start. It's about balancing instinct and control so you can last as long as the moment requires. Another truth in her experience is that composure can be a form of strength. Not the kind that intimidates or threatens, but the kind that stabilizes. Her calm disrupted the attackers more than panic ever could have. They expected chaos. They didn't know how to handle someone who refused to match their energy. That mismatch worked in her favor because it broke their rhythm. It forced them to adjust. And in that adjustment, she found opportunities. Readiness and resolve don't come from being fearless. They come from knowing that fear doesn't get the final say. They come from practicing awareness before you need it. They come from accepting that you can't predict every situation, but you can prepare yourself to stay steady inside one. They come from understanding that control isn't handed to you. It's built through hundreds of small decisions that keep you anchored when life tilts without warning.